Sex was not talked about in polite company, but you could always find someone to tell you where to get it.
20 concealed stories about sex in the American Civil War. You think you know everything about the Civil War? Think again. Today, we're diving into the concealed stories of sex, romance, and scandal that history books often overlook. Stick around. You won't believe what they never told you. Number 20. Wartime erotica. Did you know Civil War soldiers had a hidden stash of explicit materials? Discover the secret world of Civil War pornography. At camp, barracks favorites were available. These were inexpensive novels of a sexual nature. Photographs of nudity were available as well, and were purchased by both enlisted men and officers. These 12 by 15 pictures cost $1.20 for a dozen or 10 cents for a single picture. These were usually pictures of nude women doing innocent things. Nude women that were engaging in actual sexual activity were usually not white, but either black or Native American. With the soldiers being far away from their wives and sweethearts, it is speculated these were used for masturbation and not just for entertainment. Only 3 of the novels are still known to exist. They are located at the Kinsey Institute of Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. Civil War soldiers enjoyed unprecedented access to obscene materials of all sorts, including mass-produced erotic fiction, carte de visite, playing cards, and stereographs. The concentration of men in armies ushered in a wartime triumph of pornography. Illicit materials entered caps and haversacks through the mail or sold by sutlers. Soldiers found it discarded on the ground, and civilians discovered it in abandoned camps. Little of it survived the war, though, as soldiers did not keep it and archives did not collect it. Even so, porn raised concerns among reformers and lawmakers who launched a post-war campaign to combat it. At the war's end, a victorious, resurgent nation-state sought to assert its moral authority by redefining human relations of the most intimate sort, including the regulation of sex and reproduction, most evident in the Comstock Laws, a federal law and a series of state measures outlawing pornography, contraception, and abortion.
There were so many men lined up to get into the houses of prostitution in downtown during World War II that every person downtown, every civilian, every regular person knew what they were standing in line for.
Number 19. The world of prostitution. Prostitution boomed near military camps during the Civil War. What drove soldiers to these hidden brothels? There is also the uncomfortable fact that young men, away from home for the first time in their lives, whether unmarried or married, frequently availed themselves of the pleasures of the flesh while posted in the major garrison towns that the Northern Army occupied, such as Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and Nashville, Tennessee. Even in some of the more remote posts, prostitutes could and would ply their trade. Prostitution experienced its largest growth during 1861 to 1865. Some historians have speculated that this growth can be attributed to a depression and the need for women to support themselves and their families while their husbands were away at war. Other historians consider the growth of prostitution to be related to the women wanting to spread venereal disease to the opposing troops. The term public women was coined for the women that became prostitutes. There was moral outrage at this rising employment, and law officials classified the people they arrested as such. The word hooker predates the Civil War, but became popularized due to Union General Joseph Hooker's reputation of consorting with prostitutes. After the outbreak of war, the number of brothels skyrocketed. In 1864, there were 450 brothels in Washington and over 75 brothels in nearby Alexandria, Virginia. A newspaper estimated there were 5,000 public women in the district and another 2,500 in Alexandria and Georgetown, bringing the total to 7,500 by the war's third year. Prostitution was a reality near army camps, providing a source of income for some women and a way for soldiers to relieve stress. These small towns were overrun by the sex trade when army troops set up nearby camps. One soldier wrote home to his wife, "It is said that 1 house in every 10 is a bawdy house. It is a perfect Sodom." The section between what is today Pennsylvania Avenue and the Mall was a notorious red light district. During the Civil War, Union General Joseph Hooker consolidated much of Washington's seedy business into this area, attracting thousands of loose characters, as the Evening Star once put it. The area became more residential in the years following the war, and the prostitution was shut down with progressive-era regulations put forth by Congress. Also, to debunk a popular myth, this is not where the word hooker comes from. Nashville, in particular, gained some notoriety for its army of whores who occupied the rebel city shortly after the Yankees did. Of course, military authorities were more concerned with prosecuting the war, and the prostitutes became something of an embarrassment. More importantly, in the days before penicillin, they also became a major health hazard. Federal authorities in the occupied Confederate state capital tried various solutions to deal with the problem, even going to the length of rounding up the trollops, putting them aboard a steamship, and sending them back north. Unfortunately, no respectable northern city wanted thousands of prostitutes descending on them and shipped the ladies of the evening right back from whence they came. Prostitution experienced a large growth and spread across the North and South, and was one of the few industries to cross enemy lines throughout the duration of the war. However, this was a dangerous profession with risks of disease and violence. The Confederacy sometimes attempted to regulate prostitution, while the Union generally turned a blind eye.
They probably felt that their wives should be home and doing domestic duties, and they may have even had guilty and dirty thoughts about sex, so that was the role of the prostitute.
Number 18. Camp followers and companions. Who were the camp followers, and why did they risk everything to travel with the armies? Uncover their untold stories. Large armies attracted a diverse group of civilians, including women known as camp followers. These women provided various services, including cooking, laundry, and sometimes companionship for soldiers. Their presence was often tolerated, though not officially sanctioned. Prostitutes were among the camp followers following behind marching troops. When the army moved, the prostitutes moved with them. Popular legend has it that they were so common around the Army of the Potomac when Union General Joseph Hooker was in command. In 1863, these camp followers were also given the nickname Hooker's Division, ostensibly after the lifestyle of General Joseph Hooker, who had a reputation for keeping his headquarters well stocked with whiskey and entertaining women. Actually, Hooker was not a big drinker, nor was he much of a womanizer. Similarly, the commonly held belief that hookers take their name from General Hooker is probably mistaken, as the term was already in use at least as early as 1845. The number of prostitutes around Hooker's division only cemented the term.
Tired of expensive, low-effort script writers for your YouTube channel? Autoscripter.ai is the ultimate solution. Say goodbye to low-quality, poorly retention amateur scripts that fail to generate thousands of views for your channel. At a fraction of the cost, Autoscripter.ai helps your videos go viral. In just 3 steps, Autoscripter.ai creates a polished script tailored to your needs. Just input your title concept, select your tone and style. The intuitive interface makes editing and refining effortless, fast, smart, and trusted by hundreds of satisfied users who have already discovered the amazing tool. Start your free trial today and watch Autoscripter.ai transform your YouTube channel. Just click the link in the video description below now.
Number 17. Secret mistresses of the battlefield. High-ranking officers had their secrets, including kept mistresses. Find out how these relationships influenced the war. If Hooker had kept mistresses, he would not have been out of the mainstream. Confederate General Jubal Early allegedly kept 2 white mistresses having 4 children each, plus a mulatto child with a black woman. Custer is alleged to have had an ongoing relationship with his mulatto cook, an escaped slave who was pushed over a cliff in Custer's carriage when captured by Confederates. Custer's letters between him and Mrs. Custer was also captured and raised Confederate eyebrows, being described as vulgar beyond all conversation, and even those from his wife would make any honest woman blush for her sex. Even McClellan was alleged to have lived with a young mistress for the duration of his command. However, one doubts this story, at least for the time when he was in Alexandria, headquartered at the seminary, as an engraving pictures him in front of Cazenoves's family, Stuartland, with his wife and children in the background. Number 16. Gender fluidity in the ranks. Gender fluidity existed even in the 1860s. Learn about the individuals who defied gender norms during the Civil War. According to the National Archives, as many as 400 women secretly fought during the Civil War while attempting to conceal their gender. Stories of women in uniform being discovered by accident or through medical examination in a hospital were frequent enough that they became common gossip for the Army's trenches. In many cases, being discovered and exposed as women couldn't deter the female fighters. Lizzie Compton, who enlisted at the age of 14, kept getting discovered when injured in battle. Each time, she packed up her things and moved on to another regiment under a new male identity. There are many reasons behind why women decided to conceal their identities and join such a horrific war. Patriotism, a need for adventure, or simply a means of earning money. But the consistent and long-term commitment to the male identity suggests that some of these women may also, in fact, have been transgender men. It's an unknown part of history that perhaps leaves room for an untold story. Of course, transgender people have always existed, but from the average history class, you wouldn't know it. Whether they truly were our modern definition of transgender, or women trapped in a man's world seeking to save freedoms, textbooks rarely mention these historical pioneers of the Civil War.
Zieleniak. Po co nas tu przyprowadzili? Co z nami będzie?
Number 15. The life of a soldier's wife. Imagine managing a household alone while your husband fights a war. Discover the resilience of the soldier's wife. Occasionally, ordinary soldiers would share their tents with their wives. In the Confederacy, Keith Blaylock signed up with Sam Blaylock, a good-looking 16-year-old boy. Actually, his wife, Melinda. Melinda fought 3 engagements before she was wounded and found out by the regimental surgeon. Upon discharge from the Confederate Army, they continued to soldier on together as Union partisans. In the Army of the Potomac, Katie Brownell and Mary Tepp joined their husband's regiment as vivandières, enduring all of the hardships of campaigning and both being wounded in combat. Number 14. Battling diseases. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant among soldiers. How did this impact their lives in the war effort? The predictable drawback of all this sex was venereal disease, mostly syphilis and gonorrhea. Among the white troops, 73,382 cases of syphilis were reported and 109,397 cases of gonorrhea, giving a total of 82 cases of venereal disease annually per 1,000 men. Among the colored troops, syphilis had an annual rate of 33.8 cases, and gonorrheal infections 43.9 cases per 1,000. The cures were scary enough to encourage chastity. For syphilis, first-line therapy was to cauterize the chancre with a caustic chemical. Secondary therapy might involve highly toxic mercury infusions, hence the phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." For gonorrhea, treatment consisted of urethral injections of nitrate of silver, sugar of lead, or sulfate of zinc. Amazingly, in an era before penicillin, these therapies appear to have worked much of the time. Rudimentary condoms, made from sheep intestines called skins and secured with a little pink ribbon, were available, but it is anybody's guess how much protection they afforded to disease. Number 13. Officially sanctioned prostitutes. Some areas regulated prostitution to control disease. Learn about the licensed prostitutes and their medical inspections. The Union's hospital service certainly appreciated the relationship between prostitution and venereal disease and took pragmatic steps to get ahead of the problem. One of these steps was to license working girls, the license being conditioned upon periodic examination by a physician. The other, hand in hand with the first, was to establish hospitals to take out of circulation and treat prostitutes found to be infected. In fact, these measures were very effective. with Yankee casualties dropping off dramatically where instituted. As for the women, their lives were nasty, brutish, and short. One physician following a group of prostitutes noted that their life expectancy was only about 4 years once they entered the trade, alcohol and disease being major risks. Colonel George Spaulding, Provost Marshal of Nashville, introduced a system of licensed prostitution with periodic medical exams and hospital treatment for venereal disease. The number of licensed prostitutes rose and fell with the transit of troops through the city, but the incidence of disease declined sharply. A report issued after the war proclaimed the experiment a success, as testified by the influx of prostitutes. Many of the better class of prostitutes had been drawn to Nashville from northern cities by the comparative protection from venereal diseases which its licensed system afforded. In Memphis, a program of registration, inspection, treatment, and licensing met with similar success until closed at the war's end. The report of the Surgeon General of the United States Army concluded that, while it does not encourage vice, it prevents a considerable extent its worst consequences.
Well, finally, again, there was a cleanup campaign, and by September of 1944, all of the houses of prostitution in downtown Honolulu were closed down. So they were no longer functioning as openly. That didn't mean there weren't any more prostitutes. It just meant that the prostitutes went to different areas of town to continue to work.
Number 12. Sexual violence in war. The Civil War had a dark side, including sexual violence. Explore the harrowing accounts of assaults during this time. Throughout the Civil War, around 400 men were prosecuted for sexual violence crimes against women, such as the 24-year-old Margaret Brooks, calling into question the issues of sexism and racism in 19th century society. Historians will sometimes consider the American Civil War to be an anomaly among other wars because they claim the adversaries did not use widespread sexual violence as a battle tactic. However, cases of rape and assault against women, particularly African American and Southern, can still be found in unsettling numbers, littering the pages of the war's history. Some measures were taken to protect women at this time, such as General Orders 100, which developed punishments for crimes against women, and Section 30 of the Enrollment Act of 1863, which kept civilian crimes perpetrated by soldiers in the military court system. But reporting crimes and testifying was still a challenge. Most women never had the need to appear in court before, and they had to stand up before male jurors, judges, and officers. Women also had to verify their age in order to testify, which, for some, namely African American women, many of whom did not even know their birth dates, was a disheartening obstacle. Some women were able to confront their attackers and bring the crime to light on their own, such as Sarah Buford, who followed her assailant into his encampment. When he threatened to shoot her if she would not keep quiet, Buford promptly reported him. Other cases, however, went unreported for a long time, implying that the number of rape and sexual assault cases during the Civil War is likely much higher than the number of those recorded. 10-year-old America Pureman's rape was not exposed until she was examined by an Army doctor, who was able to determine that her hymen had been torn as a result of assault by a soldier. The rape of such a young child is obviously disgusting, but equally appalling is the way consent and sex were handled during the Civil War era. In Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky, the age of consent was only 10, and in most other states, it hovered around 12. Number 11. Hidden homosexuality. Same-sex relationships existed among Civil War soldiers, often kept secret. Delve into these hidden wartime bonds. While societal norms frowned upon homosexuality, there's evidence of same-sex relationships existing within the close quarters of Army camps. Soldiers might form emotional attachments and share beds for warmth, leading to speculation about the nature of these bonds. However, due to the social stigma, it's difficult to find concrete evidence of these relationships. There are not many recorded, probably because sodomy was regarded as an unspeakable crime. Though some reenactors a few years back reenacted a firing squad for two soldiers dressed in pink uniforms for conduct unbecoming, in fact, there is no record of any soldier on either side being executed for the offense of homosexuality, or, for that matter, being disciplined for the offense. However, a handful of soldiers were thrown out of the Navy. Military law did not specifically outlaw sodomy until 1921, but we should not infer from this that homosexuality was previously accepted along the lines of "don't ask, don't tell." Keep in mind that at the time of the Revolution, sodomy was punishable by death in all 13 colonies. In 1779, Thomas Jefferson proposed a more lenient penal code under which homosexuals would be castrated and lesbians would have their noses pierced with half-inch holes. Jefferson's proposal was rejected, and sodomy remained a capital crime until 1831. As recently as World War II, the usual sentence for sodomy in the United States Army was 85 years. William Manchester, in his 1979 autobiographical Goodbye, Darkness, describes the sensibilities of young Marines in the 1940s. Youth is more sophisticated today, but in our innocence, we knew almost nothing about homosexuality. We never heard of lesbians, and while we were aware that male homosexuals existed, they were regarded as degenerates and called sex perverts or simply perverts. Most of us, to our knowledge, never encountered one. The attitude of the farm boys who fought in World War II is probably pretty close to that of the farm boys who fought in the Civil War.
In many ways, the 1920s and 30s marked the beginning of a visible LGBTQ+ presence in the Western world.
Number 10. Women in espionage. Female spies used charm and seduction to gather intel. Meet the daring women who risked everything for espionage. When it comes to female heroes of the Civil War, there are many familiar names. Clara Barton took fire tending wounds on battlefields. Harriet Tubman helped hundreds of slaves escape to freedom. And Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, posing as a man named Lyons Wakeman, fought as a Union soldier with the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry, Company H. But there were heroines whose achievements might be a little shy, the female spies of the Civil War. Some women used their sexuality and charm as tools for espionage. Famous spies like Belle Boyd and Rose O'Neal Greenhow used their relationships with influential men to gather and pass on critical intelligence. Belle Boyd, in particular, was known for charming Union soldiers, extracting intelligence and passing it on to the Confederates. Ultimately, she was captured, but fell in love with and married her jailer, a familiar theme. Belle was not alone. Hundreds of women served as spies for the Union and Confederacy during the Civil War. They often carried information about the enemy's plans, troop size, and fortifications on scraps of paper or fabric, which they sewed into their blouses and petticoats or rolled into their hair. Spying redefined their traditional roles as housewives, mothers, and eligible bachelorettes and made them an important part of the war effort. In fact, Confederate military leaders were known to actively recruit women for undercover operations, mainly because of their familiarity with local customs and geography. Elaborate spy networks were established with women serving at all levels.
They played the role as kind of political gadflies during the war as well, making sure that the goals of the war, at least on the Union side, stayed clear, and the goals on the South as well.
Number 9. Intimate soldiers' letters. Passionate letters between soldiers and loved ones reveal their deepest desires and fears. Peek into their private worlds. Soldiers frequently wrote letters home, offering a glimpse into their emotional state. While explicit references to sex are rare, some letters express loneliness and a yearning for physical closeness. These letters hint at the unspoken needs of soldiers far from home. During the war, letter writing was the main form of communication between soldiers and their loved ones, helping to ease the pain of separation. Soldiers wrote letters in spare moments, sometimes from frontline trenches or in the calmer surroundings behind the lines. Censorship dictated what servicemen were permitted to disclose in their letters. However, in practice, men often found ways to impart information, and their letters offer a powerful and highly personal insight into the experience of war. If you've ever watched Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, then it's likely you remember the poignant letter Major Sullivan Ballou of the Rhode Island militia penned to his wife Sarah, a week before he was killed at the First Battle of Bull Run. While not all soldiers were as well spoken and eloquent when it came to writing letters to their loved ones, many did write about feelings of love, homesickness, heartache from time and miles spent apart, and uncertainty about what the future held. Letters between soldiers and those on the home front are a glimpse into some incredibly touching pieces of correspondence during the Civil War. Number 8. Alcohol and temptation. Alcohol was a common escape for soldiers. How did it affect their behavior in the war effort? Military surgeons documented Civil War era problems of alcohol. Statistics they compiled showed that drunkenness spiked just as soldiers entered service, coinciding with their first time away from home, and again at the end of the war as they celebrated victory. Proximity to cities also correlated with increased alcohol consumption. African American soldiers got drunk less often than their white counterparts. Just 1 in 4,500 required medical attention for alcohol problems, compared to 1 in 220 for Caucasian soldiers. Alcohol consumption was very high throughout the 19th century, sparking several temperance movements throughout the century. Much of this was caused by the belief that alcohol, specifically liquors in the whiskey family, were thought to be beneficial to one's health. Physicians would often prescribe whiskey for a variety of ailments. During the Civil War, a variety of alcoholic beverages were distributed as medicine in the forms of spiritus frumenti, whiskey, and spiritus vini gallici, brandy. Civil War surgeons typically only hospitalized soldiers for drunkenness if they were suffering severe effects. It was uncommon for a soldier to spend the night in a hospital ward for simply being drunk. Drunk soldiers were usually left in camp to sober up. One surgeon would remark about a hospital steward, "I do not know how he is at home, but here, where he can get whiskey and liquor of all kinds, like water in abundance, he is half the time unfit for duty, and the other half so disagreeable in temper that it seems as if I really got into a den of wild beasts or devils." Throughout the course of the Civil War, 4,625 Union soldiers were hospitalized or relieved from duty for inebriations. Of these, 98 died. Of the 3,284 soldiers admitted for delirium tremens, 423 died.
How old are you? 84. You was in the same war.
Number 7. The dark side of sex trafficking. Sex trafficking was a grim reality during the Civil War. Uncover the disturbing truth behind this illicit trade. The beginning of the Civil War also saw a rise in sex trafficking, and many prostitutes were abused, blackmailed, and forced to live and work in deplorable conditions. By the 19th century, most of America's cities had a designated, legally protected area of prostitution. Increased urbanization and young women entering the workforce led to greater flexibility in courtship without supervision. It is in this changing social sphere that the panic over white slavery began. This term referred to women being coerced, lured, or kidnapped for the purposes of prostitution. Numerous communities appointed vice commissions to investigate the extent of local prostitution, whether prostitutes participated in it willingly or were forced into it, and the degree to which it was organized by any cartel-type organizations. The second significant action at the local levels was to close the brothels and the red light districts. From 1910 to 1913, city after city withdrew this tolerance and forced the closing of their brothels. Opposition to openly practiced prostitution had been growing steadily throughout the last decades of the 19th century. The federal government's response to the moral panic was the Mann Act. The purpose of the act was to make it a crime to coerce transportation of unwilling women. The statute made it a crime to transport or cause to be transported or aid in obtaining transportation for, or to persuade, induce, entice, or coerce a woman to travel. Number 6. Wartime sweethearts and quick marriages. Love blossomed even in wartime. Discover the sweethearts and marriages that survived the turmoil of the Civil War. Finding love in the Civil War era could be tough. Despite the vast urbanization and ongoing industrialization of the mid-19th century, Most people in the United States lived in small communities or rural farms. When it came to matchmaking, for many, there were only so many options, especially considering the norms and expectations of the Victorian era. The Civil War exasperated this, as millions of young men left their homes for the military. Many departed for the front with hasty marriages or the promise of one upon their return, but many more enlisted with no sweetheart to write to. The problem was just as big for young women, as most age-appropriate men were off fighting. To find true love, a small number of men and women turned to the equivalent of today's online blind dating websites and phone apps: newspaper matrimonials. Newspaper matrimonials were printed in several cities throughout the United States Civil War, but most were concentrated in the New York Herald. The simple system began before the war but skyrocketed in popularity during the conflict. One paid for an advertisement in the matrimonial section of the paper, listing personal characteristics, what type of person they were seeking, and where they could be written to. Advertisements can range from being very broad and open to extremely specific. Often letters were directed to be mailed to an intermediary, who would then forward them to the intended recipient on the front lines or the blockade. Almost all requested the forwarding of a photograph of the woman writing. Many advertisements use pseudonyms to hide their identities, and the phrase, "Any communication accompanied with carte de visite will be treated as strictly confidential," was commonplace. Number 5. Morality and Soldiers' Aid Societies. Soldiers' Aid Societies aim to uphold morality. How did they impact soldiers' behavior and societal standards? Women's groups on the home front formed Soldiers' Aid Societies to provide material support for troops. These groups often sent supplies like socks, gloves, and religious materials, reflecting societal norms that viewed soldiers as needing moral guidance and a shield from potentially immoral influences. As tensions between the sections reached the boiling point and men began to prepare for war in 1861, women rushed to make preparations of their own, and their efforts would prove essential both in the Union and in the Confederacy. In both regions, women would create support groups that are sometimes called Soldiers' Aid Societies and sometimes called Ladies' Aid Societies. In the North, women had been working for decades to reform society, and one of the main aims had been the abolition of slavery. Many of these women saw the impending war as a means to finally achieve this goal, and the last thing they were willing to do was abandon the cause at such a decisive moment. Other women of the North had not been particularly active in the abolition cause, but they wanted to do what they could to help their husbands, fathers, brothers, and other loved ones preserve the Union. Southern women had also worked long and hard to defend their region's way of life, including the human bondage that underlaid the South's social and economic structures. Many of these women turned to existing mutual aid societies to begin planning for their important role in the Civil War, while others began to form new organizations specifically for the purpose of war aid. Over 3 months before the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter, Southern women came together through their existing organizations to roll bandages, and a month after the fighting began, they were making cartridges and preparing sandbags for military use.
Hell myself, President.
Number 4. War's impact on family life. The war deeply affected family life. See how families coped with separation and the challenges of the war. The long absences of soldiers disrupted family life, leading to increased reliance on extended family and community networks. Some women took on new roles as heads of households, managing farms and businesses in their husband's absence. Although women were not permitted to bear arms on the battlefront, they made invaluable contributions to and were deeply affected by the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. This was particularly true of women living in Virginia, since they witnessed more battles than did the women of any other state engaged in the conflict. The removal of hundreds of thousands of men from their homes, farms, and businesses necessitated the vastly increased participation of women, both black and white, in areas that they had been previously discouraged, if not forbidden, from pursuing. Differences of race and class, however, sometimes sharply divided their views and experiences. Some devoted everything they had to the service of the Confederacy, while others openly rebelled against it. The end of the war brought the collapse of both the Confederate government and slave society. And while freedom created a new commonality between the races and between women and men, it challenged them to redefine themselves in their society. In the words of diarist Lucy Buck from Front Royal, "We shall never, any of us, be the same as we have been." Number 3. The Contraband Trade. The contraband trade was more than just goods. What role did illicit items play in the lives of soldiers? The war disrupted the flow of many goods, including medical supplies. This led to a rise in the contraband trade, where women sometimes smuggle items like quinine, used to treat malaria, through military lines. Some historians believe they might also have smuggled comfort items desired by soldiers. At the outset of the Civil War, the Union established a blockade around the Confederacy. This prevented the Confederacy from trading for many of the supplies needed to survive the war. Skilled blockade runners can make it through the lines of Union ships, but they can only carry a small portion of the goods needed by a country at war. Confederate women took on the role of smuggling for the Confederacy. 19th century social conventions led Union soldiers to assume that all women were innocent non-combatants. This made it easier for Confederate women to transport medicine, letters, food, and other much-needed supplies across the border. Among the number were several young women whose departure from the federal capital will lighten the duties of the provost marshal. Number 2. The emotional impact of war. The emotional toll of the Civil War was immense. Hear the heart-wrenching stories of those who endured this turmoil. The war caused immense emotional strain for soldiers on both sides. Loneliness, fear of death, and separation from loved ones could lead to a need for intimacy and comfort beyond physical needs. Soldiers might seek solace in platonic or romantic relationships. The experiences of Union and Confederate soldiers during the American Civil War were often very different. Union soldiers had access to better supplies and equipment, and were often better trained and disciplined than their Confederate counterparts. This meant that Union soldiers were more likely to survive the war and had better morale. On the other hand, Confederate soldiers were often poorly equipped and lacked the same level of training and discipline. Despite this, Confederate soldiers often had a greater sense of loyalty and commitment to their cause, which helped them to endure the hardships of war. When white Southern men initially marched off to war, they took with them masculine and martial ideas that undergirded their romantic notions of war and the importance of their service. Soon, the astonishing brutality and bloodletting of the war broke men and eroded the stoic and self-reliant masculine ideal. Soldiers turned to their comrades, their wives and sweethearts, and their children for emotional strength and support. Those individuals provided an emotional bulwark for Confederate soldiers, which helped buffer the corrosive effects of war on soldier morale, self-worth, and even national identity. Furthermore, they kept the soldier tethered to his humanity and often kept him from losing his sense of self and individual identity within large Civil War armies. Number 1. The lasting legacy. The hidden stories of sex during the Civil War have a lasting legacy. How did these intimate aspects shape post-war America? After the war, many Southern men felt their manhood diminished in a manner some historians dubbed a crisis of gender. A crisis exacerbated after Confederate President Jefferson Davis was apprehended by Union soldiers wearing his wife's shawls for warmth. The false rumor quickly spread in the North that Davis was caught during his escape while dressed as a woman. Period drawings depicting Davis in full women's dress, bonnet included, were used to ridicule the Confederacy's former president. Women in the U.S. were able to engage in the different societal spheres following the Civil War. Typically, when women are allowed to stay post-Civil War in positions that they gained in the social and political spheres, there's less chance of Civil War recurring. Whereas in the economic sphere, if women keep these positions, then there is a higher chance of Civil War recurring. One thing that came from the spread of pornography during the war was the rise of anti-pornography forces, in particular, the Comstock laws. And there you have it, folks. 20 hidden stories about sex in the American Civil War. If you enjoyed this dive into the video, Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intriguing tales from history. And hey, hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep exploring the untold stories of our past.